Hello everyone to the third session of Leadership and Strategic Webinars from Northeast Ohio chapter. We'll start today our session about let's start learning from lesson learned. Agenda, introduction, the leadership webinar, let's start learning from lesson learned, question and answers, PMI Northeast Ohio chapter upcoming events, and how to claim your PDUs attending this webinar. Please, we are using a Zoom virtual platform. Be sure that you will mute your mic. For any question, use a chat feature in Zoom. Special thanks to our sponsors, Apex System, Strategic System, Tech Systems. Welcome new members in August 2020. Congratulations to newly certified leaders August 2020. Today, our speaker, Dave Davis, he has over 35 years experience as over 35 years experience as a manager, project manager, program manager, business analyst, and knowledge manager. Dave holds 3 master degrees, including an MBA, a degree in e-business, project management, and graduate of the PMI Leadership Institute Master's Program. Dave has contributed to PMI in both service and content creation. Without taking too much time, I will turn it to Dave to start. Please, Dave, you can share your screen.
Okay, I will do that. And welcome everybody. Thanks for having me. And I guess we'll get started. I'm assuming you can see my screen. If not, I'm sure somebody will tell me.
Dave, you are not sharing the screen. Yeah.
I'm not?
Yeah, I cannot see the screen.
How about now?
Yeah.
Okay, you can see Judge Green from, actually it's Judge Taylor, from To Kill a Mockingbird. And I always like to start with some way of setting a mindset, etc. And by the way, are you seeing my one with just the slide, or are you seeing my presentation view?
Yeah, I'm seeing the presentation, just the slide.
Just the slide?
Yeah,
okay.
The good one, yep.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
And this quote, and I'm a big fan of this book. I read it when I was very young. And the quote, people generally see what they look for and hear what they listen for. This gets into the whole idea of cognitive bias and different things. And when you do lessons learned, or actually about any communications throughout your project, people are going to go in with a bias and going to be looking for things, and they're going to go in there with a mindset, and they're going to find things that reinforce that their mindset went in there with. I like to use an analogy, and apologies out there to people who are fans of Tom Cruise movies. I'm not a big fan of Tom Cruise. So when I go into a Tom Cruise movie, I may be looking for the bad things in it as opposed to the good things. Why somebody that's with me that may like Tom Cruise may be looking for the good things. It's that way with lessons learned. We go in there with these preconceived biases. And we kind of, as an organization, PMOs in general, have some biases about lessons learned and how they are. Lessons learned was one of the original main concepts of project management and the benefit of bringing in project management offices and disciplines and et cetera. And the PMBOK guide has had definition of lessons learned for a long time. And it focuses on the knowledge gained. So we're talking here about, what have we learned? The knowledge gained, how the project events were addressed or should be addressed in the future for purpose of improving future performances. So we have to remember that what we're dealing with here is what have we done and what will we be able to do better in the future. So, by the way, I'm going to go through some of these slides fairly quick. I do have a lot of content. I know the meeting's for an hour and a half. I don't think we'll go that long. But as I kept working on this, and this is actually a subset of a workshop I have, more and more things came in, and I really struggled with what to keep in, what not to keep in. So I'm going to start out here with a little bit of what project management kind of looks at, the definition of lessons learned, and then I'm going to be a little critical on how we're not maximizing them. Then I'm going to look at ways how we can utilize it going forward. So when you do a lessons learned project, I mean, in theory, you bring people together. Your agenda of the meeting for a lessons learned project is, we're going to figure out what we did that worked and what we did that didn't work. And so there's usually a formal session held during project closeout near the completion of a project. And I'm going to get into some of the things going on with the Agile and the retrospectives. And not everybody is, lessons learned or post-mortem at the end. There are a lot of good project managers, good projects that do lessons learned throughout. There's a good rule of thumb that if you have a critical issue, you should do a lessons learned as soon as your critical issue is done. So you learn it when it happened and not try to be romantic about it at the end of the project. But the purpose in general is really figure out what we did good so we redo the good things and we avoid the bad things. I mean, bottom line, very simplistic, that's why we do them. And then that overall makes the PMO, make the project team better. I mean, these are all pretty simple, straightforward, motherhood apple pie, things we'll love, and very practical, pragmatic ways of running a business. And then finally, in theory, they should make us better project managers. And so we've seen lots of things over the last several years on conducting project lessons learned and how to structure them and et cetera. And actually I grabbed off the web a set of guidelines, and they're even talking about here, recruit a lessons learned facilitator who's not closely connected to the project. Sounds good that the project manager isn't guiding it or dictating it or invoking cognitive bias at the front, let people communicate, etc. Prepare for the meeting. Set ground rules and timelines for discussion. This is core. This isn't even project management 101. These are taught in management 101, how to conduct meetings properly, how to get everybody aligned, engaged, and all that. Concentrate on information in 4 general areas. What went well? Well, what didn't go too well or had unintended consequences? And if we had to do it over again, what would we do differently? And what recommendations would you make to others doing similar projects? So these are all good things, good objectives, good guidelines. Focus on the behaviors or tactics that were successful, not the people. That we're looking at what can we do better, not that somebody made a mistake. We're not trying to put blame or anything like that. And then finally, not finally, I think I got 2 more in here actually. The next one is to accept input after the session. Not everybody wants to comment in front of a group of people. And so don't contain it to you can only give input within this time of day, that you should be able to get input from anybody whenever. And then finally, guard against a bias towards negative or positive comments. Try to be objective. Observe good, rational, practical feedback. So we've had these in places, but I submit to you that most organizations are not very successful at running lessons learned. With all this stuff, why is it less than optimal? Why don't we seem to be able to maximize lessons learned? A lot of times, I've heard this joke for years. One of the things lessons learned does for us is give us an opportunity to recognize the mistake the second time we make it. That we don't do a good job of actually using lessons learned to make things better or to prevent things, that it seems to be somewhat of a formal process. And that gets into a lot of cultural issues intrinsic issues, just how do we do business as a business, and why? And so those are the next couple things I'm going to look at. This is a generic, rather common project workflow or process I've seen in a lot of different organizations. You know, you do planning, concept, et cetera, at the beginning. You know, you have a charter or you do some initiation work. Then you define and plan, you know, scope, budget, WBS, get the task, get your timeline out there, communication plan. And of course, with timelines, the first one you put out is, even if it's got 800 times of conditions, et cetera, nobody hears that. They hear the end date and say, that's not good enough, you got to move it up. So those are things that happen that we deal with as project managers. So we go through all the planning, then we get into launch and execute, monitor to control, we hear those sorts of terms. But you know, how we're going to track it, what are our key performance indicators, what are our quality things, what are our forecasts, how are we seeing what's going, then our performance and control, our objectives, are we on target, we're not on target, what behaviors do we need to modify to get back within a tolerance range of our target objectives, or what are some potential roadblocks that'll prevent us from meeting some things, or what are dependencies? Dependencies are identified back here in definition and planning. They're validated in performance and control. Then we close and post-mortem, project punishment. But my question for you, what is missing? And I guess I would encourage anybody to put anything into the chat box on what they see missing in this particular scenario. And I'm running a little blind here. I don't have my chat box locked up and open in front of me, so I'm going to have to jump in front there to get that going. I'm not seeing any comments, but I would say, there I see something. Okay. What's missing? Lessons learned. Lessons learned. Nowhere in here are we talking about review the lessons learned. I mean, we really don't even in this model have them explained as part of the postmortem. So can we assume then that when the business case was done, that as they approved the business case and the intake funnel, that they looked at lessons learned to be able to come up with some sort of schedule or whatever? I mean, how many times are you given a project and the end date's already been determined? And you got to figure out how to make that end date work, at which you should be able to look at lessons learned and evaluate risk and et cetera. But we're not very good at looking at these lessons learned and how to use them moving forward. So what does that mean? What's next for us then? What's next for us then? Let's get that slide there, click. So we need to have a scientific approach, some sort of structured method to be able to not only extract this information, but probably capture it properly, tag it properly, and how to analyze and review it. That all sounds good, but here are some of the challenges we run into. As we do lessons learned, we're not necessarily honest with ourselves. One of the things I do, one of my initiatives, is I evaluate applications for the Association of Change Management and their certification exam applications. So I have people submit applications to sit for the exam. And one of the questions that's asked on that is, give me 2 lessons learned you learned from your last project. And one of my major pet peeves is a lot of times I see people put in there lessons learned that they should have known before they even went into the project. I mean, I see people say, I learned communication is important. Well, you didn't know that going in? I mean, have you really learned anything there? Or you're just sort of like Well, this is an easy one to caption. We just need to put some things down. And I see things like, I learned stakeholder engagement needs to start at the beginning of the project. And there's sometimes the cynic in me comes out and says, why did you even have this position if you didn't know this stuff going in? How can you tell me that a fundamental piece of your job you learned going in? And project managers do this a lot, unfortunately. Yeah, communication is important, we knew going in. But what did you learn from this project that you can use in the next on communication being important? I have a good friend named Bob Morgan, and he says he can do every lessons learned in 3 sentences, 3 bullet points. Says, first of all, they'll say, there's not enough communication. Then the second thing they'll say, there were too many emails. And the third thing they'll say is, there were too many meetings. Well, aren't emails and meetings part of the communication? So we're dealing with a paradox here that we can't possibly be able to meet. So this is where biases come back in. People a lot of times seem to go in that lessons learned is what do we do wrong? What was negative? Not necessarily what can we really learn from? And with that, I'm going to propose the next piece. What I should see in the lessons learned is, not that communication is important. That one you knew going in, but you should have said to address communication in this project, we tried this approach and it resulted in that result. Not that communication is important, but we tried to do something. We tried to use a Microsoft Teams site instead of sending out meeting minutes via email. And we found out that people aren't going to go to the Teams site on a regular basis. Or, we tried to get more direct feedback regarding users' need. We recruited a team of 4 to create an online survey to capture ideas. That's an action that you can then elicitate lessons learned from. So again, the lesson learned shouldn't just be something real generic, like communication is important, stakeholder involvement is important, breathing is important. We know those things. It's what did we do in this project to try to reinforce these critical aspects that we knew going in. The next piece then here within lessons learned is what is really our flow for lessons learned. And I'm going to share with you what I would call a typical lessons learned flow. And I'll just pop all these up here at once. We identify the lessons learned. So we get a whole bunch of group of people together and we maybe round robin and give me a lesson learned, give me a lesson learned. What did we learn and maybe what would be valuable for future projects? And then we try to document them. Excuse me. I like a documentation method I call a CAB, which is really 3 paragraphs. One is the circumstance. So what was I dealing with? The second is what action did I take? And the third, what was the benefit from the action? So that's just a model for how to document a lessons learned. And then we should have an owner, who's responsible, who came up with it. And then finally, any supporting artifacts. We learned that an Excel spreadsheet that had this critical data in a sortable column was usable. Or we found that, that we broke out the information into too many columns and we got confused as to how to exactly sort it, those sorts of things. But that we've documented something that supports what we identified as the lessons learned. And then we should do some analysis, the cause and effect. And analysis isn't that we sit there at the meeting and we automatically pre-conclude what it was. Unfortunately, that's what I see happen a lot. But that we analyze by looking, what caused us to be in this situation and what did it affect later on? And these shouldn't always be negatives. I mean, there's some positive things that we should be able to identify. We're not really good about that. Then we need to be able to store this information properly. And we really need to have a knowledge management system. We need to have the knowledge identified, need to have it properly tagged. There's a whole discipline. You can even get PhDs in knowledge management and how exactly to be able to retrieve that data, store that data properly, identify that data to be able to go through multiple layers of intrinsic and et cetera, applied, inherited data from something else, all those different things. I'm not saying that we need to get to that level in our lessons learned, because that's most likely, if you get into the knowledge level that they have at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., you're probably spending too much money on what you can really get the value back on. But we still should be able to figure out quickly, where do these things fit in? For example, if I go back to communication, that we learned in here that doing a 1-minute video once a month by the sponsor was effective communication to keep the team's enthusiasm going. That'd be a communication tag. So we store it, then we should be able to retrieve it. I should be able to go into any project that had this particular objective and be able to retrieve communication snippets. Let's say you've been given a project that has to do with some sort of network enhancement. You're in a hospital and you're going from a standard grade wireless system to a medical grade wireless system. You should be able to go and look at other projects that involve putting in wireless systems and communication, and then be able to see what worked, what didn't work. But we aren't always good at that. And so what are some of our challenges to effectively handling lessons learned? Because we have some things that are very effective, then we have some things that are ineffective. And I would venture to say it's based on the culture of your organization and the true commitment of your organization from top to bottom on continually learning, on making ourselves more knowledgeable, better, adding tools to our toolkit. So some of the challenges I've seen that organizations have in effective lessons learned: first, it's an afterthought. It's at the end of the project, half the project team's already been dispersed on other new projects, or people are tired of it. We have project fatigue is real. I mean, people are just kind of tired of it, or they figure, oh, we've already talked about it, everybody knows it, who cares? Oh, it's the end of the project, let's get it done with. And yeah, let's do it and check the checklist. Because the organization isn't putting necessarily the continuous improvement objective against it. It's not sexy, and you get little attention from upper management. I've had multiple lessons learned projects where we would invite sponsors and et cetera, and they wouldn't bother to come. They just didn't really care, and you give them a report out afterward, or try to schedule a meeting so we can review lessons learned and read them back to you. And they'd accept the meeting invite, and then 5 minutes before it's supposed to start, decline because they had something more important to do. I mean, the behavior speaks a lot, and in the upper management or the executive's behavior is, I've got something more important than listen to what you learned on lessons learned, the whole organization is going to start to think, well, this isn't really all that important. You know, we'll check a checkbox and get on with life. Next one. It's seen as a project management task. It doesn't seem to have ownership from the organization or the enterprise. Back in those guidelines earlier, I talked about how effective it'd be to bring in an outside facilitator that wasn't actively involved in the project. I've tried to do that a couple times, and it's very hard. Oh, I'm not funded to do that. I'm not supposed to do that. This is my job. I'm going to stay within my rails, and my rails isn't doing this. To do it effectively, it's a lot of work. If you do a 2 hours lesson learned session, you probably should have a couple hours of prep beforehand, and definitely a couple hours, if not 5 times as many hours, capturing, documenting, structuring, communicating, analyzing what the lessons learned truly were. And this is kind of seen, the project manager should do that. Who is the last person who should do that because of the bias that the project manager comes into the lessons learned session with. And there's really not a lot of attention to how the lesson sessions are conducted. Sometimes I've seen multitude of sessions. I've seen some that were very involved and they had sticky notes and they put them in butcher block paper and tried to do affinity grouping and different stuff. And I've seen others where it's like, okay, who's got a lesson to learn? Document. Anybody have anything? Well, I guess we didn't learn anything. Thank you for coming. We'll put together a little something and send it out, and thank you. And the project manager then puts together a couple paragraphs that says something like, we learned communication is important. We learned that the stakeholders should be actively involved. We learned that risk mitigation should be analyzed frequently. And we kind of lost the spirit of what we're trying to do, which is continuously learn, build better project managers, redo the things that worked, avoid the things that didn't. And then the last actually has to do with political correctness. We don't want to necessarily offend somebody, or we feel that there's one organization that, well, is there correct? There's not a politically correct way to say this. There's an organization that we're not going to hold accountable for the thing they did wrong, or give undue credit to some organization because their head carries a lot of clout in the overall department, in the enterprise, and we don't want to get them mad at us. So we've got a lot of human issues here. Again, back to cognitive bias, different types of emotional intelligence, mindset, some of those things that may impede effective lessons learned. And we're all probably guilty of this to some extent. Yeah, we understand constructive criticism, but we don't really necessarily think that you should spend a lot of time on it. And as an organization, very few organizations are going to come in and say, well, yeah, we should do better, but thanks, we did good. And, okay. Or somebody suggests something, say, oh, that'll never happen here, that'll never change, so-and-so doesn't want to do it, so we don't even try. So that's why we have some ineffective lessons learned. Effective ones are truly where there's people engaged, items are taken, we're going to look at some examples of this later. Items are taken from it, action is taken on it. In order for these to work, certain things the organization must have, do, whatever term we want to say. Trust. What I talked about a lot, and I see the comment in here from Danielle, appreciate it, on the PC's biggest challenge. We don't necessarily have trust. I mean, I feel if I go in there and say something that I feel is the way it is, it'll cost me the rest of the time. Go in there and say, well, one of the problems I had is that the network people didn't show up to the meetings until like a week before it was ready to go live. And as we went live, they kept saying, well, nobody told me this, nobody told me that. That's because they weren't engaged. But I don't really want to say that. Another part, dedication of time to lessons learned. We already talked about a lot of times they're at the end of the project. And I also suggest, how many times are they at the end of the project on a Friday afternoon? I mean, literally, they're not focused on a major item that is a high priority, that we need to dedicate time, and that you need to make this your highest priority, that you can't say something more important came up. So we need to dedicate the time to lessons learned. And we need to know from a PMO perspective, how to make sure we can maximize that time, getting the right information in, being able to to glean the right lessons learned to take action moving forward. We also don't necessarily dedicate the money to lessons learned that we should. And by money, that means things such as training people on how to participate in lessons learned, how to learn from lessons learned, how to go into lessons learned repository and glean out information, how to look at that and analyze. Now, I'm jumping ahead. I'm going to talk about some of these things later, but investing in the people on the lessons learned, not just within the core team, but within our stakeholders and our suppliers. We need to adopt a lean/value stream principles. And by that, we need to look in here on how can we reduce our wait times. And waste is a big part of lean, to eliminate waste. And they kind of look at waste in two huge buckets, right? Time spent in queue. You know, something gets done on a Friday afternoon and it gets sent to somebody's desk. It sits on their desk over the weekend, Monday morning email, etc. Maybe doesn't even get tested till Tuesday. So we've lost 72 plus hours of time while it's in a queue. So that's one area of waste. Another area of waste is doing things that really didn't add value. And how do we identify those? Lessons learned should be able to help us glean those out, and value stream principles make the value stream so we're constantly flowing. And not only what caused these delays, but how do we eliminate some delays? What are some things that we did to improve these queues, etc.? Lessons learned shouldn't just be the negative, but what are things we did that worked? Continuous improvement, and this goes back to the culture of the organization. Is the organization continually trying to improve itself? A lot of times organizations get into a mode that if it isn't a 15 to 20% improvement, it's not worth our time. Well, I would position that 1% improvement 20 times a year is a 20% improvement, and it's just as good as one major 10 to 15% improvement. One of the selling points of Agile is that every iteration, you try to get 1% improvement or maybe 2% improvement as a stretch goal for velocity and those sorts of things. Because over time, like I said, if every iteration, you know, if you do 25 two-week iterations a year and you improve 1% at each one of those, you're improving 25% over the course of the year to be able to reduce waste, increase efficiencies, etc. So you need to constantly be improving, and you need to be willing to take risk, and etc. We need to be open to things we're doing wrong, and one of the big buzzwords right at the moment is fail fast. You know, try something. If we realize it isn't working, hit the brakes and go to something else or take a different approach. These all sound great on whiteboards and motivational posters and memes on the internet, but they're hard to sell in real life. But we need to keep working at them. This is the constant work of being willing to take risk, try, fail, a safe environment, those sorts of things all need to apply. And I admit a lot of these are quote agile buzzwords, unquote, but they apply to no matter what type of project, whether it be, you know, if you look at types, whether it be an agile type, an iterative, a waterfall / predictive, or whether it be a change management, software development, software implementation, infrastructure, it doesn't matter. I mean, all these things apply no matter what type of project that is. And then make the lessons learned an organizational event, not a project management to-do task. And for those of you heading PMOs out there, that's my challenge to you. Get the enterprise engaged to commit to this. That needs to come from the top. No more discussion on that. That's not a grassroots effort. That's a cultural change, cultural behavior effort that needs to be demonstrated, walk the talk from leadership. Okay, and then utilize them. Many times we've done lessons learned and some very good lessons learned, and they go off into a digital junk drawer. They go off somewhere. You know, well, we wrote a Word document and it's out on a SharePoint drive, or we did a PowerPoint and it's off on a SharePoint drive, or I never even bothered to put it in the SharePoint drive. I just emailed it to a bunch of people, and we don't really go back and use them. So, give a question out there. What if at the start of a project, we reflect on lessons learned from a similar project? You know, I already looked at a process flow before that, never even talked about looking at lessons learned. What about if we really spent time and energy bringing back the key players on a similar project we did in the past and let them guide us for what to do in this new project going forward? Okay. I got a couple questions. I was thinking of doing these as a poll, but I'm just going to put them out there. And this I've already talked about, but does your organization have lessons, review lessons learned as a function in their project delivery process? And I think some of you answered, most of you answered no, or kind of, sort of, or, you know, yes, we have it, but we don't always do it. And then there's some that do say yes. And there's some organizations, there's some mature organizations that utilize this well. And they're the ones that I think you'll find are the excellent organizations. And then I talked about this before. How does your organization really store lessons learned? Do they? Do they have a formal repository, or do they store them in emails? I've been in an organization where lessons learned were emailed to one specific email box. And so if you ever needed to look at lessons learned, you could go in that email box and look at them. A lot of times they're stored in organized directories on a shared drive, be it in SharePoint, Teams, or even within the project management application, which helps a little bit. But if they're files within a SharePoint, and your organization does 200 projects a year, and after 5 years, you got 200 Word documents per year times 5, you got 1,000 Word documents. It's not easy to go through there. And also, we all know the reality of this is you got to start the project right away. Project managers are never given time to think and plan. I shouldn't say that, never. It's rare. And I think Mallory, who was talking about before, is probably an example of why it's an effective organization is they give time, they factor in time in order for the project manager to be proactive, to look at it, to do analysis, and apply things in order to make this successful. So another thing that's going on, and I think is important, and I bring it up here at the beginning, things are going away from project management to more product management. Projects are working a unique piece of work with a defined beginning, defined end, to deliver something of value to be used. Why product is more of a continuous delivery. My guess is over the next 3-4 years in the project management world, you're going to see less and less predictive, less and less agile, and more product focused, where there's a series of different work activities to keep improving that product that the customer uses, to keep adding value to the product. And we're not going to have elongated projects of which we're trying to cram in what's this in scope, what's this not in scope. We're going to have smaller, more quote agile, unquote agile teams enhancing the product. And so if you look at your lessons learned, are we looking at what are my project learned or what are my product learned, and how can I improve in this? Like I said, in project, traditionally, scope, budget, time are triple constraint. Work management, who's doing what, the WBS. Predictive, so we're looking at different ways on how can we better at doing scope, how can we do better at doing time, you know, how can we do a better definition of done or end, and really the project kind of looking at the ROI, you know, business case. Well, what I think you're going to be seeing with product moving forward is continuous value. We're not going to be as focused on scope, budget, time. We're going to be focused on delivering consumable solutions that our customers will be able to utilize and being able to adapt accordingly to whatever changes are happening that will drive some of that. We're going to be focused more on benefits. Not necessarily activities that contribute to the end project, but we're going to be looking at benefits, like what are the customer tangible and intangible. So there's going to be financial one, but there's also going to be more look at things such as net promoter score. How likely is my customer going to be to recommend this to somebody else based on their experience? So we're going to be looking more on that line for the product. What are things we did in this product that the customer liked? Oh, we designed a car and we had 14 cup holders and they liked that. So the next one, let's put in 15. I think we've seen things like that in the real world, which, you know, that's a whole nother discussion, but that's an example, illustrative of looking at things other than just bottom line ROI. But the economic value add is never going to go away. It's always going to be a main driver. Adaptive. What did we adapt? Or what did we adopt that was maybe good from somewhere else? They're going to be ongoing. For the product is ongoing. It doesn't necessarily have an end. It's ongoing. We implemented this functionality in this billing system. We are now able to calculate sales tax in all states within the United States, to be able to discern between consumable food items and capital goods, etc. Whatever the details are. But it's an ongoing. And then the next one will do how to be able to do that sales tax and to be able to adjust it with any sort of customer rewards plan and etc. I don't want to get too much into details there because I don't have them. I want to be illustrative. And then finally, the investment's going to be on value. And value is going to do a couple different areas. It's going to be revenue, but it's also going to do things with compliance of government regulations or other sort of regulation, customer needs and wants and expectations. You know, customers are going to want more and more mobile apps. They're going to want everything at their fingertips. So that's where the value drives the investment. I think we'll be seeing more and more. I think as we do lessons learned throughout the life cycle, we need to come on and look at how do we drive and improve the product and deliver more consumable value to our customers. Now, next one. Have you ever had training on how to conduct a project's lessons learned session? Because I'll tell you, I went on the internet here not too long ago and looked for one. I couldn't find any organization that really offered a class with the intent of teaching you how to be able to analyze lessons learned to glean what was important out of it. So I don't see anybody commenting anything in chat. My guess is not too many, if very many. Maybe you've had some good mentors, but bringing in new project managers, do we sit down with them and say, this is how we do lessons learned? Probably not. Okay. And there's some techniques. And again, I kind of apologize. This does bounce around a little bit, but so do lessons learned. They bounce around a little bit. We bring in new project managers and we throw them at, oh, let's do a lessons learned session or do a requirement solicitation session, which they have a lot of similarities because it's getting knowledge and thoughts from the participants. So what are some of the techniques? Round robin. Round robin is basically everybody in the team. You say there's 12 people. You start with person 1. What did you learn? Person 2, person 3, and they can either pass or say something. And if they pass, you go around once, you come back and they have a chance to contribute the second time. So the first time with 12 people, maybe 10 people provide something. Then you start the second one and you maybe get 8 people, but one of them didn't produce or didn't provide any information to one before. And you go around until you've exhausted the list. Another technique, butcher block paper. That's one where somebody puts some sort of wide piece of paper on and maybe they have a timeline and say, go in there and in this timeline, maybe a sticky note, put in what we learned at this point in time, what should have happened here. So we try to give some sort of context, and it could be a timeline or it could be a process flow. It could be different things, but give me some sort of a context of where we learned this lesson or where we should have applied something, whatever we want to do. It's a technique. Another technique is sticky notes. And one of the things with sticky notes is when you're done with all the sticky notes, you do what's called an affinity process, which basically means we group like items together. And some people try to get to the point where they try to do the affinity ahead of time. And if you have this type of thought, put it on a green sticky note. If you have that kind of thought, put it on a yellow sticky note. And if you have the third kind of thought, put it on a pink sticky note. And then you end up in sticky note hell, for lack of a better term. Don't try to put too much intelligence into dumb things. But sticky notes is very effective, and it can be used virtually. There's a lot of tools now, Miro or Lino or some of those others that let you do sticky note things virtually. Those first couple I talked about really were focused, especially Butcher Block is focused more at everybody in the same physical area, which, as we know with COVID and et cetera, isn't as common as it used to be. And then there's a dots. throughout the session or whatever, people put notes up, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end, they may be given 10 little dots to go put on. There's 30 items there. You got to pick of these 30, you've got 10 dots. So that means 10 that you think are important to be looking at forward. And of the 30, once all that's said and done, there may be half a dozen that didn't get any dots. So those immediately go into the circular file. And then there may be some that have a dot from everybody, so that goes at the top of the list. But these are just different techniques. And then storytelling is one. That one takes a little bit more time, but it helps to dig into a little bit more of the context around things. So these are just different techniques that we need to learn, and they will help us to be able to get that data, get the information extracted from different folks. I am sharing with you an actual lessons learned template from a healthcare organization. It's been redacted, but they literally would give this to new project managers and say, this is how we do lessons learned. Here's the template, go off and do lessons learned. This is why I titled it, We Need to Learn from Lessons Learned. This is a formula for failure. Not only do we help do anything to put structure around this, it's literally sink or swim type thing. Oh, here's a template, go off and do it. What does it mean in the template? I mean, we have things here, the categories. What even fits into these categories? Agenda, what could we start? What could we stop? I mean, I can start a car, I can stop a car. Where does it fit into what? I mean, are we talking processes? Are we talking product? What? We do have a nice little quote in here, an African proverb, which is, don't look where you fail, but where you slipped, or don't look where you fall, but where you slipped. Okay. Then we have some post-it notes we go around with, and then final thoughts. We can't do lessons learned by throwing templates at people. I mean, yeah, that's nice, the thought's good, but we need to put context around this on how do we utilize it. Jonathan, I noticed your question on there about conducting qualitative and quantitative lessons learned. I do talk about that a little bit later. I think it's important, but I think that's a multiple step that you're not going to do in the same session. You're not necessarily going to qualify and quantify them, but you get items and then you have somebody to go spend time outside of that lessons learned session to qualify and quantify. That's just like benefits realization, same exact technique for a benefit. What is this really driving as a benefit? Now, there's a woman there in Cleveland, actually, that I've done some work with her in the past. Her name's Linda Carter, and she owns CEC Training. And down at the bottom, I actually have a link to YouTube. I'm not sure how this PowerPoint will be able to get to you. But she talks about your intent as you're going into a lessons learned session, that you can go into with one or two ways, either a reflective or an intentional intent. And the reflective is really what we're probably more familiar with. And she has a story in this YouTube about a tortoise and a hare. The tortoise is actually reflective, looking at a nonprofit, but it's looking back on the project. What did we learn? And really reflecting on what our experiences are. And then she compares it with the hare, and the hare is intentional learning. So it's looking at the project as an opportunity. What do we know? What can we learn to be competitive? And I don't know how I got that extra E in there, but oops, it slipped by the quality control. But learning is a result of being assertive on what we would like to learn. You probably wouldn't want to do both of these in the same sessions, but they're different approaches because contextually, you may have different things you're trying to acquire knowledge from your team on that we put under an umbrella of lessons learned. So reflective is, let's think back, look back on what we did. Intentional is, what can we learn from this? Is there something we specifically want to learn? Intentional may be a little bit more applicable at the start of a project. What are some things we want to learn on this? But I think based on where you're at, these are some approaches that you can take to add a little bit more intensity to your lessons learned. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about has to do with how people think. And love him or hate him, there's a very successful basketball coach many years ago named Bobby Knight. And he was a basketball coach at University of Indiana. He won a couple national championships, and he threw chairs at referees. He did lots of things. But he's also written this book on the power of negative thinking. And I really like some of the things he talks about there. With the power of negative thinking, he said he didn't win games as much as he didn't lose them, that he was prepared for different circumstances. And they actually use an example of a national championship game they had against the University of Syracuse. Syracuse scored a go-ahead basket with like 3.5 seconds left. And they started celebrating everything because people thought, oh, Indiana will call timeout and plan what to do. Well, they didn't. They immediately took the ball out of bounds, a couple passes, went down the court, scored a basket with 1 second left, won the national championship. Because they had practiced that. They had spent time preparing what to do in different situations, so they were ready for it. And that's what I think some of these, intentional lessons learned are. Up at the front, it's applying them. It's applying lessons learned, or applying this knowledge. Or how can we deal with it without having to stop and look at it? And also a lot of just avoid the mistakes. Again, he didn't win the games as much as he didn't lose them because they didn't have as many mistakes. He was prepared. His team was prepared. And I think the lesson from this, the project manager needs to help your team be prepared. And then be thoughtful of what could go wrong. I think we use the term risk mitigation a lot for that. But there's lots of things that are not risk mitigators that could go wrong that you need to have planned out. And that's where the project manager or project lead, whatever role we want to call you, Scrum Master, et cetera, is a critical component of. If you look at the Agile Scrum world, the Scrum Master's one of their main jobs is to clear roadblocks. Well, that's where be thoughtful of what could go wrong comes in. How can we clear those roadblocks? What are potential roadblocks that we could overcome? Let me talk about overcoming. Things we need to overcome, and this is going to go to all project types, et cetera. I talked about this a little bit before. Stop rewarding the arsonist for putting out the fire. We do this a lot. At the last minute, the project, something happens, somebody goes in and does something Herculean, wonderful, brings it back on track, and we're able to go live. Well, that same person wasn't as engaged in the project throughout as they should have been. They didn't necessarily complete all their tasks, or they weren't the quality they should have been. But at the end, we reward them because at the last minute, they did something that helped get it over the finish line. We need the executives and the leader to give it more than lip service. So we need to overcome it just giving it lip service, active involvement. We already talked about not being real. And that we do spend a lot of time identifying stuff I should have known as a lesson learned. I learned communication is important. Well, you know what? You should have known that going in. And not trying to apply something that we've learned. So we need to overcome this bias of, okay, there's lessons learned on the shelf. We need to take them off the shelf and say, what can we use from this lessons learned to maybe make things better the next iteration? Another thing that we need to look at in there is our skills enhancement. We aren't very good at saying, we need to improve some of these skills going in. We didn't have the knowledge we needed necessarily to implement this technology, so we were learning on the fly. Or we completely missed it in this area, and we need to enhance our skills for everybody. Maybe we aren't very good at true risk mitigation. Maybe we don't know when to bring in insurance for something to mitigate a risk, as opposed to, well, we'll just go with it. Systematic improvement, just overall, how can we improve the system? How can we improve our input funnel? How can we go back at the beginning and make this a little bit easier? We are getting into a mode where we're going to be doing Instead of a, quote, project management skill, you're going to have a set of micro skills. We do that today that you utilize in a lot of different functions. Analysis, critical thinking, those sorts of skills, they're going to be applying everywhere. And maybe we're not as good at critical thinking as we need to be. And real skills, not general topics. Oh, we need to get better at analyzing data. No, maybe what part of the data? We're not good at forecasting. Our forecasts were very well off because we used sunny day scenarios, or we didn't factor in anything with people taking vacation, or we over factored that in, or we assumed everybody was dedicated to this project 100% of the time. And guess what? They couldn't even get started on it till we were 3 weeks into it. So real skills. And then I've already talked about this general question. Have you ever had training on how to extract lessons learned? And I'll just go into, which is usually the case for me. Sometimes I run down some shiny objects and end up kind of getting rushed for time. I've talked about this, but do we have training on extracting learnings or storing learning? Do we really have training on how to tag knowledge? Do we have training for what type of keywords to look for in lessons learned, how to identify similar projects or even dissimilar projects, or maybe different organizations? You know, this is going to be a little bit different because we're dealing with HR as opposed to dealing with finance. That with HR, you need to be a little bit more focused on these human factor elements of quality, while with finance, it may be much more focused on return on investment. Do we know how to do the different types of reasoning? Deductive, inductive. I mean, if I get up in the morning and walk out the back door and the grass is wet, did it rain overnight, or does my neighbor have a sprinkler system that went crazy? Deductive reason. Why is the grass wet? Look around. Oh, there's no water on the roof, so it didn't rain overnight. And guess what? My neighbor's fence has water on the side of it. Then there's also inductive, abductive, backward induction, these different things. And there are a lot of good trainings out there on using these different types of thinking, and a lot of good artifacts, resources on the web, 6 hats of thinking, et cetera, et cetera. But we need to spend time as a PMO looking at this. And Laura, you bring up an excellent point about how empowered is a PM to really be able to address some of these issues. And that is a major issue. That's why I said at the beginning that it needs to be culture, needs to be driven by executives, et cetera, et cetera. You're spot on. I couldn't agree with you more. Because your job's to deliver projects, right? Stay in your lane. There's been around a while, and I got a note actually today from Dr. Giamavi, who I've known for several years. He's in South Africa, I believe. And there's actually the Guild of Project Controls, and there's what's known as a double loop learning from Argus and Schoen. And this is just illustrative. I'm not going to spend much time on it. There's information there. But they look at double loop. A lot of what I've been talking about is single loop, from results to strategy. Double loop even takes it back to your assumptions. And this input, tool, technique, output, actually that model's going away from the PMBOK guide. I don't know if how many of you are aware that the PMBOK guide is going to be principles based and not tools and techniques based. But we really need to say, how can we get better assumptions based on our lessons learned, based on the results of our lessons learned? And try to look at that application throughout the entire life cycle. Again, I don't care if it's an agile project, a waterfall project, a software-defined methodology project, infrastructure project. A lot of times we get in trouble by our assumptions not being accurate, not being validated, or to a question or statement earlier, I think it was Paul, qualified and quantified. And really, if an assumption isn't validated, it should turn into a risk. But I'm not sure we're real good at that. But that's one of the things from lessons learned. We should learn how to get better assumptions and get those resolved quickly so we don't have as many risks to deal with. Let me just throw in Agile. I could spend a lot of time. Agile or Scrum has this thing called a retrospective ceremony. By the way, I used to borrow this graphic from Louis Conclaves, but it's, you know, the whole idea of retrospectives is as we get to the end of an iteration, we get everybody together, we set the stage. It means we look at the data, the context of where we are, and our insights. What do we think we did well? What didn't we do well? What are some things we can improve? And then we take an initiative to be able to improve the product or the process or the velocity of an agile team for each iteration. And as I talked about before, if you do 25 two-week iterations over the course of the year and you improve 1% at each iteration, you should be improving by 25%, excuse me, yeah, 25% over the course of a year. Agile bakes it into the process, at least Scrum bakes it into the process. I'm proposing in regular elongated project, we should be baking into the process this idea of retrospectives. How can we do better on both our way of delivering the product and our way of enhancing the product that we're developing? And then scientific approach. Does your organization follow a scientific method to applying lessons learned? Or do we just say, well, hopefully you'll go out and apply some? That's another thing we're not very good at training our skill sets on applying scientific methods, on truly doing. And granted, some people do have green belts and black belts and have covered those, and that they're covered very heavily in the Six Sigma world. But I think we could do better from a PMO perspective for all our project managers to be able to take a little bit more of a scientific approach to improving. But then back to the point earlier, I think that was made by Laura, you're told to deliver the project. There's a lot of organizations that I have seen and been a part of that they basically say, the project manager, your job is to take good meeting minutes and drive the task to be done. Escalate issues immediately. You're a glorified clerk. That's not sustainable. I mean, you need to look at ways of how you can have a purpose and to be able to add yourself, your little mark of yourself to the whole thing. And within there, and I just put this in, I use this statement a lot because when we talk mindset, cognitive bias, etc., it's how you say things that's important. I learned this lesson back in the 90s, that I could say something that 75% of project failure is due to poor project sponsor involvement. And the project sponsor will say, no problem with me, I'm cavalier, you know, the sun rises and sets with me, not an issue. Or you can say 25% of highly successful projects can be attributed to active involvement. Yeah, I'll be involved, I'll be engaged. You got any ideas how I can be more helpful? Saying the same data here, but a different approach. And I think you're going to be much more successful, especially as you're trying to apply scientific methods, to look more at the positive approach. Look more at the 25% are successful as opposed to 75% fail. And I think you should have improvement goals. I don't know why you couldn't have in your project plan. From this lesson I learned somewhere in time and be able to quantify or describe the lesson, we're going to do this on this project, and we hope to achieve the following. We are going to do daily 15 minutes calls for the team and hope to be able to achieve faster issue closure. You know, for example, because a lot of times, and I don't see this in lessons learned, but a lot of times I see what happens is issues, it's Darwinian management, you know, only the strongest survive. There's some that just linger on, and finally you say, heck with it, I'm just closing it. But what if you took some time as you're planning your project or your sprint or whatever, your iteration, from this lesson learned, we're going to try it on this project and we're going to do something. You know, we're going to get people to more actively be involved in reading status reports. We may offer some kind of reward. You know, at the bottom of each one, we'll have a trivia question. And the first person to respond to the trivia question, blah, blah, blah. By the way, I've tried that. lessons learned from that. There's like 2 people that read them and get them in real quick, and the whole rest of the team gets demotivated really quickly. But it did get 2 people reading the status reports, or at least scanning through them quickly for what was the trivia question. But those are things you need to do. You need to be able to add some freshness and variety and get people a little bit more engaged. One of the challenges I have with the agile concept of self-governing teams is most of the teams I deal with really aren't self-governing. They kind of approach, you tell me what to do and I reserve the right whether to say you're right or wrong. As a project manager, we need to balance that. We need to have that constant art-science balance to be able to make sure that we get the proper motivation, the proper engagement, the proper ownership. PMI has disciplined agile, and I'm just going to put this up here to be real quickly. One of the things they have in disciplined agile is guided continuous improvement, and that their argument is with guided continuous improvement, you will be able to be much more productive, much quicker. And guided continuous improvement is just that, where you as the project manager / lead are continually introducing activities, approaches, whatever, to help the team be more productive, coach and use recommendations from the team and implement them to continuously improve. And it's not just velocity of completing story points within an iteration, but it has to do with quality and being able to extract different pieces of data from elsewhere, getting engagement from stakeholders. So guided continuous improvement is something I think we need to start doing in all our projects. And some groups have been doing it. You know, that's the other thing to remember. Just because somebody comes and says this is what we should be doing doesn't mean that nobody's ever done it in the past. I mean, there's really not all that many new things. I mean, I could argue that Agile is more of a marketing than anything else. A lot of, the Agile purists are not going to be happy with me on that. But a lot of the Agile tools, techniques have been around for a long time. I mean, I joined the workforce in the 70s, and you know what? We were doing daily stand-up meetings then. We had our list of top 10 items that we should be working on in the state. And we had blockers. You know, what do we need to do? We didn't necessarily call it definition of done, but we had definitions of done. So a lot of this is just that continuous stick-to-itness as a project manager, guided continuous improvement. And this is one of the things that I am definitely open to for ideas. I submit that most project managers do a fantastic job of detecting potential problem, take preventative action, and the problem never even happens. How do we capture that? How do we teach it to other team members? How do we implement it for continuous improvement? You know, it goes back to that deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, etc. A lot of it's the art of project management. But they're able to look and see certain signals and say, oh, we need to take this action because that's happening. And gosh, I wish we could find better ways to be able to capture that, because that's the true knowledge factor that experienced project managers bring to the table. Cultural intelligence. You know, how do not only organizations interact, but what motivates them, what demotivates them? Yeah, plus your history of people and asking questions, et cetera, et cetera. And then influence. You spend a lot of time influencing decision makers, team members, different things. How can we better capture lessons learned and train future project managers on some of the techniques of influence? I can send you a class where you can have, you know, this influence, you can influence in this scenario, blah, blah, blah. But that's nice academic work. It's not the real world. You know, earlier I think Laura had mentioned something about, you know, how can we influence things because we're here at the lower level, blah, blah, blah. Maybe it's things such as getting a cup of coffee, and if the head of the, you know, the CIO's there, just talking to them. You know, something that maybe not significant at all, but may lead some questions. You know, things like, you know, Our value stream. Do you think we're going to adopt more value stream engineering? You know, I'm sure the CIO is like, oh, great, I just wanted a cup of coffee and they're asking me about value stream engineering. But that's how we get it. That's how influence happens. You build the trust, you get the credibility. And it's not just by having the proper status reports with all the punctuation and everything in Arial point 10 font. It's the day-to-day human interactions. Can start winding down here. This is something I saw this from a disciplined agile, but what if you spent time and actually did some mapping? Before the question was asked about quantitative, qualitative, and this is kind of a quantitative, but how can we take some idea and look at action? So we have, everybody didn't understand the objective, so maybe some actions may be better intake process, vision box, portfolio and product that more involved, allocating people's value streams, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to go through these one by one, but I'm going to illustrate this idea of what you can do with your lessons learned is try to be able to map those ideas to actions we can take. And I tell you, this is the type of chart executives love. It's high level, very pinpoint, visual, and they think they can use it to be able to influence change. Okay, I'm getting near towards the end, and yeah, I hear everybody. I'm going to share with you a lady I've known for several years, Emily Lujbretz. I don't know if I get her name right. To me, she's M to PM. I've known her for several years, and we've done a lot of things together within the project management world. She has a blog out there. She had one thing about 6 ways to improve communication. Her positioning is part of our problem with lessons learned is we're not very good at communicating those. Not only within our team, but just communicating to external stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. You know, how do you get the head of the PMO who's got hundreds of emails a day to spend a few minutes to read yours? Understanding your team and your stakeholders, what does motivate them? It may be, and it's not necessarily going to be one size fits all. But you don't have time to write customized status reports for 25 different stakeholders. So it's maybe how you position it. Maybe you do some things graphically. Burn down charts are very good to include in the body of the email because it gives people a quick view of progress being made. But understand your team and their stakeholders. And by that, what she's basically saying is, you know, communication has a lot to do with how well I know everybody. Are they looking for different things? And I'll say also that there's some different pieces here regarding things such as if people are auditory learners, visual learners, or hands-on. I mean, you can, and that's why I like using 3 bullet points under things. I'll say, see, use the verb see. As you can see, X, Y, Z, that gets the visual learners. You know, or you might do something along the lines of listening to the people, we extracted this, and that gets the auditory learners. And then maybe roll up my sleeves to get those hands-on people. But those key use of different verbs will help you understand to communicate better. Seek out collaborators. You don't have to do it all yourself. Let me repeat that. You don't have to do it all yourself. Project managers are their own worst enemy in trying to be Hercules or whatever, trying to be everything to everybody. If there's people on the team that want to collaborate and be involved in it, welcome them, embrace them, especially if it's things such as putting together some sort of chart or graphic to demonstrate something. There's a lot of people that are very comfortable doing that type of work. Embrace them, engage them, seek out those collaborators, and it'll help everything work a little bit better as you go along. This is 101, next one, communication plan. Plans are just that, they're plans. It's actually executing them, adapting to what's working, what isn't working, and let people know that what they should be expecting, and get feedback if they have comments or whatever. Next one, delegate. And that gets back to that one with seek out collaborators a little bit. Remember earlier I talked about, it bothers me that some groups or measure the effectiveness of their project manager by how well they take meeting minutes. I was used to be in the mindset that I would assign a scribe at a meeting to take the meeting minutes and share the wealth. I think places are getting away from that a little bit, but I never saw a problem with it. It kept the people actively engaged, and it also freed up the project manager to conduct the meeting. I'm sure you've all been involved in this, and you probably have, same level of frustration I do with nails on a chalkboard level. People are writing in OneNote and they're typing in notes while we're having the meeting. And so we're all sitting around for another 15, 20 seconds while somebody's typing in something. And then they make a spelling mistake and somebody's got to immediately correct the spelling mistake and go back and fix that. Delegate. When I talked about waste of time, that's a waste of time, is everybody watching somebody else type and criticizing if they spelled a word wrong. Assess your delivery methods. Not only what you communicate, but how you do it. And you can try some different ways on how. You're obviously not going to be able to have face-to-faces with everybody. You're not going to be able to do calls, but nothing's stopping you from every now and then just randomly calling somebody and say, hey, did you get a chance to look at that report I sent out last week? And what do you think? Or did you even read it? And I'm okay if you didn't. I'm just trying to see, if there's ways I can improve it. Oh, you didn't read it. What can I do to make you want to read it? And it's your art. And then finally, learn from others. Don't be afraid to ask for help. And basically, tell me why you think that way. Just talk to me. And this doesn't have to do just with lessons learned. This is everything throughout your life. Lessons learned themselves are a collaborative effort. M talked about collaboration. What do I mean when I talk about a collaborative effort? That's working together, achieve a common goal. Capturing knowledge, I say, basically comes down to the bottom line of lessons learned is capturing knowledge, turning that into wisdom to apply to be better at the next project. Create something of value. It's not just busy work. Everybody contributes. Nobody feels like an outsider. Check the ego at the door. I had the experience about 15 years ago of seeing Gene Kranz and Jim Lovell, who were the commander of Apollo 13 and the command center control, give a presentation. And I fortunately had a chance to talk to Gene Kranz afterward one-on-one. And his very important point was teaching people to check the ego at the door. And that he would actually send people away from a meeting if he thought they were being too boisterous. He would actually tell them, go outside, get a cup of coffee, come back, and remember to check your ego at the door. And he had such a commanding presence. I mean, there's no way you'd say no to the guy. I mean, it's like, yes, Gene, I'll do it. But that mindset or that environment he was establishing was so critical and so important for success. Differences aren't tolerated, but they're celebrated. And these are things you've all seen these before. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but as a project manager, it's being able to implement these things. Straight talk, candor, critical feedback. And you may need to be there to the point where critical feedback was given to somebody, and you may need to be there to reassure the person that there's still a person of value. You wear a lot of hats. Sometimes you're the bad guy, sometimes you're the good guy, sometimes you're just an observer. But you need to utilize your skills and knowledge on when to be which. No bullying. Plain and simple, that's the non-negotiable. And bullying is any time where you're dehumanizing another person. And then it's actually driven by the culture. So you need to have a positive culture on all this going in. And there's an African proverb I caught on here that I think is important. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. That's why collaboration is important. On some things, I 100% agree. You can do it quicker yourself. You know, leave me alone. Let me just do it. We'll get it done. Why, if I had the whole team here, it'd take us 2 weeks. That's true. But on the other hand, sometimes that 2 weeks is what you need for the team. I have to give a sports analogy, so I'll give a sports analogy here from Jim Leyland, who used to be a manager for the Pittsburgh Pirates and also Detroit Tigers. And I saw him at one of those winter smokers, and he was talking about, you know, had a young pitcher, and he got in a lot of trouble early in his career. In like the month of April, the pitcher was in a situation, and he went out to the mound, and he let the pitcher stay in. The pitcher ended up walking 2 players, giving up a 3-run homer, and losing the game. And Leland caught a lot of criticism, blah, blah, blah. And his response was, I wasn't playing for that game. I was playing for the season. And guess what? Come September, when they were in a pennant drive, that same pitcher was out there. He went out to him and just said, I have confidence in you. And that pitcher, instead of 2 walks and a home run, had 2 strikeouts and a pop out. So he didn't play for that game. He played for the season. And sometimes you need to do that as a project manager. That's one of my lessons learned at 30 years in this business, that you need to decide on your own when to go alone and when to get with a lot of people. Okay, summary. We talked about lessons learned, step in the process, high value, enterprise, knowledge management. Got to train the people on how to extract wisdom. PMI and PMBOK Guide 5 talked about their data, information, knowledge, wisdom model. Firm believer in that. Project manager's goal is to be at the wisdom level and help to apply wisdom across the team. Sessions, are you going to be reflective or are you going to be intentional? Continuous improvement with retrospective, constantly improving your communication. And then that little map I had on mapping factors to process. And I'm going to leave you with a quote, one of my favorites from one of my favorite authors from C.S. Lewis. Why does this matter? Why would doing a lessons learned, 3 months into a 6-month project matter, or a retrospective matter? And that's because you can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you're at and change the ending. And you need to be able to provide that motivation. You need to be the guiding light. I know some of this is kind of hokey and all that blah, 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 but it applies. People are looking to you not only to make sure the work gets done, but to help them feel positive, a contributor. And yeah, there's 1 or 2 that aren't. There's old curmudgeons. Old curmudgeons will always be around. I found on old curmudgeons, though, deep down, they hold a lot of respect. I mean, you earn their respect by treating people with value and doing some of these things. And I offer to you that starting tomorrow, you can't change the beginning, but you can apply some of the things we talked about and change the ending. So I thank you. That's my contact information. I appreciate the comments in the box. And I guess I will turn it over. You get 1.5 PDU, so it wasn't just rambling, but we had you scheduled for an hour and a half. So, and thank you for the comments coming in on the Zooms. And I think we got a few other things we're going to be doing here over the course of the next year and a half or whatever. By the way, I just live down the road from y'all in Columbus. And I've been working with the Cleveland chapter, well, Northeast Ohio for many years. Some of you may remember me from presentations in the past. So you want to take it away?
Hi, Dave. Yeah, just a reminder for attendees, they can use the chat feature in Zoom for questions. And yeah, I'm sharing.
And by the way, I will send you a copy of this file, or people can just email me if they want a copy. I don't know how you want to distribute it.
Yeah, it would be good if we can get a copy of this one, because we will email the presentation
Okay.
with a recorded video for the attendees. Just as we said, the question on chat features, they can use it. And just a reminder for upcoming chapter events, they can visit the PMINEO.org events. Click on the events, they will see the list of the events. In 9/16, we have a social event, 9/23, 20 Women in Project Management Virtual Book Club, 9/26 Chapter Planning Meeting. October 2020, Northeast Ohio Chapter will host a panel discussion with medical experts, HR, and managers to discuss safely returning to work during COVID-19. More details about this event will be posted on the website. 11/5 Vision 2020, Professional Development Day and International Project Management Day as well. Reminder for people who hold a certificate or credential from BMI, how to keep up with the PDUs. PMINEO chapter events, we are offering a technical event every third Thursday of each month at noon. And this leadership and strategy sessions at evening. Projectmanagement.com has a webinars, free webinars, and a broadcast. Page down. This is the claim for 1.5 PDU leadership. Just go through chat. I'll keep this for people to take the details. Yeah, looking for the chat. We don't have a question, so I'm gonna thank everyone, and thank you, Dave, for this presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Hope we'll see you in the next year, 2021.
Okay.
Thanks everyone.